The polls strongly suggest, and I looked at them earlier this morning, suggest that if elections were held today, and February 10th is not a very long time away, that the Likud party and Netanyahu will win. And since the math in the Israeli parliament is inclined to favor a right or center-right coalition, the odds are, barring some extraordinary development between now and February 10th, that Benjamin Netanyahu would be the next Israeli prime minister. But I would argue to you that even if it was Ehud Barak or Tzipi Livni, Israel's calculation on Iran is more or less going to be the same. Now, Israel cannot and will not, in my judgment, attack Iran unilaterally without the acquiescence, I would argue, full support of the United States. This is not a incipient Syrian nuclear weapons facility or nuclear facility on the banks of the Euphrates. This is not the Osirak reactor, which the Israelis took out unilaterally in 1981. This is a highly complicated, well-defended, redundant series of nuclear installations and enrichment processing plants, many of which are probably subterranean. Iran is a very serious country. It's demonstrated that during the Iran-Iraq War in terms of its capacity to sacrifice in a way that we, and certainly not even the Israelis, could contemplate. So the notion that Israel would go off and attack Iran on its own without any regard for American interests, well, I would argue that's unacceptable. So more likely than not, sometime in the spring, probably in April or May, whoever the Israeli prime minister is will come to Washington and have the following conversation with the President of the United States. Mr. President, I come here as representative of your close ally. We're a democratic country. We're now facing the most existential threat that's confronted. And if it's Netanyahu, he will say the Jewish people in our history. We cannot allow this situation to continue. We may not share assessments on when or if Iran will cross the nuclear threshold, but you must understand our position. That'll be the first conversation. No timetable, no threats. How we're going to respond is anybody's guess. The last thing we need is another war against a Muslim country. We have two ongoing at the moment. So I would argue, and I'm really going out on a limb here, which I don't like to do. I don't think in the next 2 years you're going to see either a unilateral Israeli military attack or an American attack against Iran. I don't believe that's coming. But in the end, it will be the dynamic between an Israeli prime minister and a new American president that will set the stage for at least our response and diplomacy. We will do everything we possibly can in the next year to change the dynamic and the nature of our relationship with the Iranians. You can have elections in June in Iran. It may be that the supreme leader who holds the real power in that country makes the decision, as he did to elect President Ahmadinejad the first time, that Iran needs a new face. It needs a new president. And if that is the case, then Ahmadinejad will not be reelected to a second term. So I'm not that much of a determinist to believe that this is on a collision course or on a highway toward disaster. But then again, we don't know, do we?
Ambassador Miller, I enjoyed your article in Newsweek a couple of weeks ago. It was very similar to what you talked about, very fair. My question to you today is, how do you get the Palestinian Authority, or Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, to get back together? What will it take to get them back as one?
Thanks for your question. You've identified that in my judgment, the single greatest obstacle to a serious negotiation is that particular problem. Israelis put up their own problems. They're incredibly divided. And the settlement enterprise is ongoing, still ongoing, for reasons that have more to do with ideology and domestic politics than they do with Israel's national interest or certainly its security. But in terms of obstacles, that's the one. An honest man or woman, and I mean this seriously, not in an effort to dodge your question, couldn't answer that question. We, Gulliver, in our present state, can't do much. We could no more fix the problem of a divided and dysfunctional Palestinian house than we could fix any of the other intrusions and interventions that we've managed. We don't do this well. And American hands will always be viewed as conspiratorial hands. So the closer we get to this, the more of a mess we're going to make of it. But unity is still required for the reasons I pointed out. Without unity, how can you have a Palestinian partner that can speak in the name of all Palestinians, or to whom an Israeli prime minister would make a concession? And when I say unified house, I mean one gun, one authority, and one negotiating position. These are the elements of responsible, credible polities in today's world. If you don't control the guns, and I'm not talking about criminal enterprise. I mean, the last piece of advice Americans should give to other peoples is a monopoly on the forces of violence. It's true, Americans own guns. People kill all the time. But they don't organize themselves into political groups to overthrow the government or secede. Florida doesn't take itself out of the Union and set up a tiny little entity with a charter and an ideology which is juxtaposed to the central government. We resolved that question once in the late 18th century and again in the mid-19th century. It's done for us. And for most states that survive and are credible, the French, the British, even the Russians, the Palestinians face this problem. Without finding a way to fix it, they will never achieve their national aspirations. It's cruel, it's harsh, but it's true. Now, we could do a much better job empowering Mahmoud Abbas. There is a theory, and the Bush administration pursued it. I think it was a fantasy, and that is it's the Kevin Costner equivalent of build it and they will come. The logic was, in Field of Dreams, the logic was if we support Mahmoud Abbas, we empower him, we train his security services, we sponsor a negotiation between he and the Israelis, that if a deal could be reached on the shelf, that most Palestinians would now understand that their future lay with Abbas and not Hamas. It's a very compelling idea. If we could make it work, I think it might have succeeded. But we can't. And we didn't. Because we're not prepared to be tough enough with the Israelis with respect to things they do on the ground, which every day undercuts Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah. We weren't prepared to take seriously the idea of negotiations in the Bush administration. We subcontracted it out. We weren't serious about it. And frankly, the gaps on Jerusalem and refugees, which are the two most contentious issues, to this day can't be bridged between Israelis and Palestinians. So the whole notion of building it and they will come was never seriously tested. So I wish I had an answer to this question, but I don't. It is analysis that leads to paralysis. And therein lies the big challenge for the Obama administration. When they, one more example, it's going to take hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild Gaza.